Somewhere, right now, someone is calling a shadow the sky, not out of foolishness, but out of habit. Because the wall has been in front of them since before they had a word for wall. And so, gently, let this be asked of you. What have you mistaken for true? Simply because it was familiar. What chain have you stopped noticing? Simply because it never moved. The absence of doubt is not the presence of truth. It is only silence. And silence has never once been evidence of anything. Ask yourself too what you want, and then ask again, more slowly this time probably. Is it a wanting that rose up freely, or a wanting worn smoothly by everything you were never given the chance to ask for? Because the mind denied long enough learns to stop reaching, calls the empty hand enough, calls the narrowed life contentment. And who could blame it? Wanting unmet for years becomes a wound, and the mind, in mercy to itself, simply stops touching the wound. So, do not mistake a quiet life for a chosen one until you have asked it honestly. If the door has been open, would you have stayed? And if you ever do turn your head, if you ever do rise from where you have been sitting since before you cannot remember sitting, know that the light will not feel like relief. It will feel like being unmade. It will sting the eyes that only ever learnt the dark. And this is not a sign you have gone wrong. This is what growth has always felt like. In every age, in every cave, uncomfortable by design, not by accident. Because nothing that leaves you unchanged was ever really growth at all. And when at last you think you've arrived, when you believe you have found the one fixed shape of the good, the final word, the eternal answer, carved once and for all, pause there too. Because the moment a river is called finished, it has already moved on without you. The moment a truth is called forever, it has already begun to age. Hold your answers the way you hold water in open hands, firmly enough to drink, loosely enough to let it keep becoming whatever it needs to become next. You do not need the final answer to act with a clear heart today. You do not need the whole mountain in view to take the next honest step upon it. Look only at what is actually in front of you, what is actually asked of you right now, and meet it. That has always been enough. So, here is the whole of it, distilled to what a person can carry in one hand. Question what you have accepted only because it was familiar. Ask what your wanting has forgotten how to want. Let discomfort be the shape that growth arrives in. Hold every answer loosely, even the ones you love, and keep walking towards the light. Not because you will ever fully arrive, but because the walking itself is the only truth that was never a shadow. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes from realizing you have never seen a perfect circle, not on paper, not on a screen, not in the compass drawn geometry of a schoolroom, not even in the orbit of a planet, which wobbles and elongates under the tug of every other mass in the universe. And yet, you know exactly what a perfect circle is. You would recognize a flaw in one instantly, a slight flattening, an errant bulge, even though no flawless specimen has ever been placed before your eyes to serve as the standard against which the flaw is measured. Somewhere, without ever being taught in the ordinary sense, you have acquired a certainty that outstrips all the evidence your senses have ever supplied you. It was this quiet, almost embarrassing gap between what we perceive and what we know that unsettled a young Athenian nobleman enough to build out of it one of the most audacious architectures in the history of thought. Plato was not merely proposing a theory when he set down the doctrine of the forms. He was answering an emergency. And to understand why the emergency was real, we have to stand for a moment exactly where he stood. Two ghosts haunted Plato's Athens. The first was Heraclitus, who had declared that all things flow, that the world is a river into which no one steps twice, because neither the water nor the person stepping is the same an instant later. Change was not a feature of reality for Heraclitus, it was reality. The second ghost was Parmenides, who arrive at the opposite extremity by pure logical force. If being truly is, it cannot come into existence or pass out of it, cannot alter, cannot be many where it was one. Change, motion, plurality, all of it, Parmenides insisted, was illusion laid over a single motionless, eternal being. Between these two enormous claims, ordinary human knowledge found itself crushed. If Heraclitus was right, nothing could ever be known because knowledge requires a stable object to know. You cannot pin down a definition of justice if justice keeps dissolving and reforming with every situation, every culture, every mood of the crowd. And this was not an abstract worry, it was Socrates' daily occupation, wandering the agora, asking craftsmen and generals and priests, what is courage really? And watching every answer collapse into a mere example, a single instance that failed the moment a counterexample was raised. Definitions kept slipping through their hands like water. If Parmenides was right, on the other hand, the entire changing world we inhabit, friendship, illness, sunrise, grief, was simply false, a mirage laid over a frozen, undifferentiated one. And philosophy would have nothing to say about a single thing we actually lived through. Plato's genius was not to referee this quarrel, but to zone it. He kept Heraclitus' flux, but demoted it, confined it to the physical sensory world where things are born, decay, and die. And he kept Parmenides' changeless, eternal being, but relocated it into a second, non-physical realm, invisible to the eyes and accessible only to reason. Two philosophers who could not be reconciled on a single plane, where, on Plato's design, no longer required to occupy one. This is the founding gesture of the theory of forms, not a mystical impulse, but an act of metaphysical zoning, drawn to save the very possibility of knowledge. In this design, the physical world, the one you and I bump against, weep in, fall ill within, is a world of becoming. Every object here is mid-transaction between birth and dissolution. The flower is already wilting the moment it blooms. The beautiful face is already aging in the instant it is admired. Nothing here holds still long enough to be known with certainty. At best, it can be believed in, glimpsed, opined about. Behind this restless world, Plato posits a second, the world of being. Here resides the forms, not mental constructs, not linguistic conventions, but the most real things that exist. More real, paradoxically, than the chair you are sitting on. The form of beauty does not age. The form of justice is not on some Tuesday betrayed by a corrupt court. The form of a circle contains no flattened arc. Every object in the physical world is only what it is, by participating in or imperfectly copying its corresponding form, the way a portrait participates in its subject without ever quite becoming the person portrayed. And these forms are not a flat democracy of ideals. They are arranged in ascending ranks, from the forms of ordinary things, up through mathematical forms, up further still to the greater ethical and aesthetic forms like truth, beauty, and justice, until the entire structure culminates in the form of the good. Not merely the best of the forms, but the source from which all the other derive their intelligibility and their very being. In the Republic, Plato reaches for the only image adequate to this claim, the sun. As the sun does not merely illuminate objects, but makes seeing itself possible. The good does not merely rank highest among truths, but makes the very act of understanding possible. Without it, Plato suggests, the mind would possess objects of thought, but no light by which to grasp them. It is worth resisting the temptation to treat the allegory of cave as a well-worn illustration we already know by heart. Read it again slowly, and it becomes something closer to an acquisition. Prisoners, chained since birth, face a wall. Behind them, a fire burns. Between the fire and their backs, unseen hands carry cut-out figures, casting shadows on the wall the prisoners face. The prisoners have never turned their heads. For them, the shadows are not representations of reality. They are the entirety of reality, full stop. They have developed elaborate systems for predicting which shadow follows which, and they honor among themselves whoever grows most skilled at this prediction. No one in the cave experiences themselves as deprived. The chains do not feel like chains because nothing has ever felt like anything else. One prisoner is dragged out, not persuaded, dragged, because Plato is honest enough to admit that no one leaves illusion willingly. The climb is described as painful. The light outside does not clarify but blinds, only slowly by stages. First shadow and reflections in the water, then the objects themselves, and then finally the sun. Does the freed prisoner's eye adjust to seeing what actually is there? And when, moved by something like compassion, he returns underground to tell the others, he finds himself clumsy in the dark again, mocked as a man who has ruined his eyesight by wandering off some pointless errand. The allegory ends not in triumph, but in the distinct possibility of the returning philosopher being killed by the prisoners he came back to liberate. An allegory, scholars have long noted, shadowed by the face of Socrates himself, executed by the city he tried to wake. What makes the story endure is not its imagery, but its structure, the claim that comfort inside illusion and awareness of illusion are mutually exclusive experiences, that no one trapped in an partial view can feel the partiality from within it, and that the movement towards truth is not addictive, not simply more information, but disorienting, even violent to the self that must undergo it. It is tempting to treat the cave as a universal grammar for Enlightenment traditions everywhere. The same story, wearing different cultural clothes, and roughly 6 centuries after Plato, on a different continent entirely, the Buddhist philosopher Nag Arjuna arrives at a diagnosis that looks on the surface remarkably similar. Ordinary beings mistake appearances for reality, and the philosophical work is required to see correctly. But it is precisely here, at the point of apparent convergence, that the deepest disagreement in comparative philosophy opens up. His central weapon is Pratitya Samutpad, the doctrine of dependent origination, the observation that nothing arises except in dependence on causes, conditions, and relations to other things. From this observation, he derives, through relentless dialectical argument, in the Mulya Madhyamakarika, the doctrine of Shunyat, emptiness. Nothing possesses Swabhav, an inherent independent essence, because anything genuinely independent could not be caused by anything, could not change, could not relate to anything else. And yet, everything we encounter is caused, changes, and relates. Therefore, nothing, not chairs, not selves, not even emptiness as a concept, has a fixed essential nature, standing behind its appearances, waiting to be discovered. Notice precisely where this serves from Plato. Plato's liberated prisoner ascends out of the cave to find a second, more stable world lying in wait. The forms are still there, still fixed, still real, whether or not anyone climbs up to see them. Nagarjun, awakened practitioners, does not travel anywhere. There is no second world to arrive at. Enlightenment for Nagarjun is not the discovery of a hidden, permanent form of the good behind the flux. It is the dissolution of the very expectation that any such permanent essence must exist for things to be meaningful. Where Plato adds a relium to rescue certainty, Nagarjun subtracts an assumption to dissolve the demand for it. And yet, Nagarjun is careful, through his doctrine of the two truths, not to collapse into nihilism. Conventionally, chairs, persons, sufferings, and healings are entirely real and function exactly as they appear to. Ultimately, none of them possess independent essence. They are what? They are only relationally, only provisionally, only through webs of cause. This is, in a strange way, a more demanding form of liberation than Plato, because it offers no fixed harbor, no eternal form of the good sitting serenely above the storm. It asks the practitioner to find stability within impermanence itself, rather than by escaping into an unchanging elsewhere. It would be comfortable to file all of this under ancient history, Athens and its shadows, a debate settled by the passage of 2.5 millennia. But the structure of the cave has not required an ancient setting to keep reproducing itself. It has simply changed its furnitures. Consider the modern information environment. An algorithm curates what you see, your experience, the curated feed, not as curated, but as simply what is happening in the world. Engagement, not truth, casts the shadow on this particular wall, and exactly in the Plato's cave, the prisoners inside it become extraordinarily skilled at predicting and participating in the shadow play, mistaking fluency within the system for understanding of the world beyond it. The discomfort of encountering a genuinely different framework, a fact that unsettles the feed's prior patterns, produce something very close to the blinding pain Plato describes in The Ascent, which is perhaps why so much of contemporary discourse resembles the returning philosopher being shouted down by prisoners, certain that their eyes, not his, see clearly. But the more searching contemporary application may be closer to home. In the very field this reflection keeps returning to, the gap between the health knowledge and the person holds and the health agency they are permitted to exercise. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's concept of adaptive preference, the way people narrow their own desires to fit the deprivation they have long endured until they no longer register the deprivation as a felt loss is structurally a modern redescription of the chained prisoner who does not experience the chains as chains. A woman who has never had autonomous access to healthcare may not report wanting it, not because the want has been rationally weighed and declined, but because the very capacity to want it has been shaped by its absence. She is not lying when she says she is content. She is, in Plato's vocabulary, watching shadows and calling them the whole of the wall. Here, the two traditions offer two different kinds of intervention, and the difference matters practically, not merely academically. A Platonist response reaches for a fixed form of the good, standing above and outside the deprivation. Education as the dragging towards the light, an appeal to an objective standard of flourishing that exists whether or not the deprived subject currently perceives it. It is a powerful frame, but it carries a risk. It can slide into paternalism, the philosopher king deciding on behalf of the prisoner what the sunlight actually contains. A Nagarjuna response, by contrast, offers no external form to appeal to. It insists instead that the very condition producing the adaptive preference are themselves dependently arisen, contingent, and therefore changeable, without needing to posit any fixed essence of the good life, waiting in a separate metaphysical tour. Suffering and its causes are real at the conventional level. They simply are not written into the fabric of an internal order that must be discovered from above. In practice, this reframes capability expansion not as a revelation from on high, but as the patient, relational work of altering the condition, material, social, epistemic, from which the narrowed preference arose in the first place. Strip away the metaphysical scaffolding, the immortal soul, the separate non-spatial realm, the geometry of the divided line, and something durable remains, a residue that has outlived every objection raised against it since Aristotle first argued that forms should live inside things rather than in some other dimension. It is this insistence that what presents itself to the senses is never self-certifying, that comfort within a view is no longer evidence of its truth, and that every era constructs its own cave walls, its own fire, its own skilled interpreters of shadow, entirely convinced that they have escaped the very structure they are standing inside. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the theory of forms is not the specific furniture Plato placed in his second world, but the discipline of asking again and again, of every settled certainty, is this the sun, or it is merely the best lit shadow I have found so far? Nagarjuna would add a further turn of the screw. Ask too whether the very impulse to seek a final, unmoving sun is not itself another shadow, cast by the mind's old hunger for permanence in a world that offers none. Between these two provocations, one insisting there is a fixed truth worth the difficult climb, the other insisting the climb itself must let go of fixity as its object, lies not a settled answer, but a standing invitation to keep turning one's head. Two thinkers, two civilizations, 600 years apart, and both arrived at the same starting point. Most of what we call reality is just what we have gotten used to seeing. Plato said there's a deeper, truer world behind appearances, and we need to train our minds to reach it. Nagarjuna said there is no fixed deeper world at all, just endless webs of things depending on each other. And our job is to stop clinging to the idea of anything fixed. They disagree on the destination, but they agree on the starting diagnosis. We mistake the familiar for the true simply because it's familiar. The prisoners in the Plato's cave weren't unhappy. They had games, rankings, a whole social order built around guessing the shadows correctly. Discomfort never told them anything was wrong because nothing about their situation felt wrong from inside. If a belief, a habit, or a way of living has simply never been questioned, that's not evidence it's correct. It might just mean you have never turned your head. The absence of doubt is not the same as the presence of truth. What you want is often shaped by what you have been denied. This is the sharpest, most human part of the theory. People who have lived for years without access to good healthcare, education, or freedom often stop asking for these things, not because they have decided they don't need them, but because wanting something you can never have becomes exhausting. So the mind quietly lowers the demand. Psychologists and economists call this adaptive preference. Therefore, before assuming someone is satisfied, ask whether that satisfaction was really arrived at, or whether it was shaped by years of not having a choice. Real contentment and adjusted resignation can look identical from the outside. The only way to tell them apart is to ask what would happen if the barriers were removed. When Plato's freed prisoner first sees sunlight, he's not enlightened instantly. In fact, he's blinded. Real growth in this theory does not feel good on arrival. It feels disorienting before it feels clear. If learning something new, unlearning an old belief, or seeing your situation differently feels uncomfortable, that discomfort is not a sign you're going the wrong way. It's often the exact sign that you're leaving a cave you didn't know you were in.